The sound of heavy machinery filled the air as I stood in my front yard, watching a massive bulldozer roll toward my Victorian mansion. The HOA president stood behind me with a smug smile, arms crossed, savoring what she thought was her moment of ultimate victory. For 18 months, she had made my life a living hell with constant harassment, bogus fines, and threats. Now she was finally getting what she wanted: the demolition of my dream home. "You should have listened when you had the chance," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Now you will lose everything." The bulldozer operator climbed down from his machine and walked toward us, clipboard in hand. The HOA president stepped forward, ready to give the final order. That is when I reached into my jacket and pulled out a thick folder of documents that I had been hiding for months. "Actually," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart, "there is something you need to know first. You are about to demolish a house that sits on federal land." 6 months earlier, I was driving through the countryside when I spotted the most beautiful Victorian mansion I had ever seen. It sat on a hill overlooking a valley, with intricate woodwork and stained glass windows that caught the afternoon sunlight perfectly. A weathered "For Sale" sign hung from the front gate, and I knew immediately that I had to have it. The property was part of a complex estate sale. The previous owner had been an elderly woman who lived alone for decades. Her family lived across the country and wanted to sell quickly. The house sat on what appeared to be a large lot within a gated community called Sunset Ridge Estates. The price was surprisingly reasonable, though it needed significant renovation work. I spent weeks researching the property and the surrounding area. The paperwork was complicated, involving multiple previous owners and old property transfers dating back generations. But my real estate agent assured me that everything was in order. The house was mine if I wanted it. I used every penny of my savings for the down payment. This was not just a house purchase. This was my chance to create the home I had always dreamed of. After years of living in cramped apartments and dealing with noisy neighbors, I finally had the opportunity to own something truly special. The renovation process consumed my life for the next 4 months. I worked evenings and weekends, stripping old paint, refinishing hardwood floors, and carefully restoring the original architectural details. Every room had a story, and I was determined to honor the house's history while making it my own. The neighbors in Sunset Ridge Estates were friendly but curious. They often stopped by to watch my progress and ask questions about my plans. Some seemed genuinely interested in the restoration work. Others asked more pointed questions about property boundaries and whether I had reviewed the HOA covenants. I found their questions odd but not concerning. Every neighborhood has its busybodies, and I assumed they were just being protective of their property values. I was too focused on my renovation work to pay much attention to their concerns. The house transformation was remarkable. What had been a neglected and forgotten mansion was becoming a showpiece. The original hardwood floors gleamed under new lighting. The stained glass windows sparkled after careful cleaning. The wraparound porch became my favorite spot to drink coffee and watch the sunrise. As I put the finishing touches on the interior, I began to notice that some neighbors were paying more attention to my property than seemed normal. They would slow down when driving past, sometimes stopping to take pictures. A few even walked up to the property line with measuring tapes, though they always left when they saw me watching. I mentioned these observations to my real estate agent, who suggested that the neighbors might be curious about the property's value after the renovations. Property values in the area had been rising, and my restoration work was certainly increasing the overall appeal of the neighborhood. The paperwork confusion that had surrounded the original purchase continued to surface occasionally. I received letters from various government offices asking for clarification on property boundaries and zoning classifications. Most of these seemed like routine bureaucratic requests, so I filed them away and made mental notes to address them later. By the time I finished the renovations, I had created something truly special. The Victorian mansion was not just a house anymore. It was a testament to craftsmanship, history, and the power of vision. I had poured my heart, soul, and bank account into this project, and the results were beyond my wildest dreams. My first introduction to the Sunset Ridge Estates HOA came in the form of a certified letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning. The envelope was thick and official-looking, with violation notice stamped in red letters across the front. My hands trembled as I opened it and read the contents. According to the letter, my property was in violation of multiple HOA covenants and restrictions. The list was extensive and ridiculous. My mailbox was the wrong color. My landscaping did not meet community standards. My house paint colors were not approved by the Architectural Review Committee. The letter demanded immediate compliance and threatened daily fines of $500 until all violations were corrected. I was stunned. Nobody had ever mentioned these requirements during the purchase process. I had never signed any HOA agreements or been given any community guidelines. How could I be in violation of rules I had never seen? The letter instructed me to attend the next HOA board meeting to discuss the violations. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 o'clock in the evening at the community center. I marked my calendar and prepared to defend my property rights. The community center was packed when I arrived. Nearly 50 homeowners filled the small room, most looking frustrated and defeated. The atmosphere was tense, with quiet conversations happening in every corner. I found an empty seat near the back and watched as the board members took their positions at the front of the room. The HOA president was a woman named Margaret Stevens. She was in her 60s, with perfectly styled gray hair and a no-nonsense attitude that filled the room the moment she spoke. She called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel and immediately began reviewing violation notices and fines. One by one, homeowners were called forward to discuss their violations. A young couple was fined for having the wrong type of flowers in their front yard. An elderly man was cited for parking his car on the street overnight. A family with small children was threatened with legal action for having chalk drawings on their driveway. Margaret Stevens ruled over these proceedings like a queen holding court. She showed no sympathy for financial hardship, personal circumstances, or reasonable explanations. The rules were the rules, and compliance was not optional. Several homeowners tried to argue their cases, but she shut them down with threats of increased fines and legal action. When my name was called, I walked to the front of the room with my shoulders squared and my head held high. I was not going to be intimidated by this power-hungry woman and her ridiculous rules. "You have multiple violations on your property," Margaret Stevens said, reading from a thick file. "These violations must be corrected within 30 days, or you will face daily fines and potential legal action." "I was never given any HOA documents," I replied. "I was never told about these rules. How can I be in violation of agreements I never signed?" Margaret Stevens looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. "Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse. Your property is part of this community, and you will comply with our standards." "What standards?" I asked. "My house is a beautifully restored Victorian mansion that increases property values for the entire neighborhood. What exactly is the problem?" "The problem," Margaret Stevens said, her voice rising, is that you think you can do whatever you want without regard for community standards. Your property is an eyesore that sets a dangerous precedent for other homeowners who might think they can ignore our authority. The room fell silent. I could feel the eyes of 50 homeowners watching this confrontation unfold. Some looked sympathetic, but most looked afraid. This was clearly not the first time Margaret Stevens had used intimidation tactics to maintain control. "I will not be bullied," I said firmly. "My property is legal, beautiful, and well-maintained. If you want to find me, you better have the legal authority to do so." Margaret Stevens smiled coldly. "Oh, we have the authority, and if you choose to fight us, you will discover just how much authority we have." The harassment began immediately after that first HOA meeting. Every morning, I would find new violation notices tucked under my windshield wipers or taped to my front door. The citations were increasingly petty and absurd. My grass was half an inch too tall. My garden hose was visible from the street. My porch light was not the approved wattage. Each violation came with a $500 fine and a demand for immediate compliance. Within 2 weeks, I had accumulated over $8,000 in alleged fines. The letters kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. I hired a lawyer named David Chen, who specialized in property disputes and HOA conflicts. David was expensive, but he came highly recommended and promised to fight aggressively on my behalf. Our first meeting lasted 3 hours as I explained the situation and showed him the mountain of violation notices. "This is clearly harassment," David said, reviewing the citations. "No reasonable HOA would issue this many violations for such minor issues. We need to file a response immediately and demand that they provide proof of their authority over your property." David sent a formal letter to the HOA demanding to see the original covenants and restrictions that supposedly governed my property. He also requested documentation proving that my land was actually part of their jurisdiction. The response came back within a week, and it was not what we expected. The HOA claimed that my property had been included in their covenants through a blanket agreement signed by the original developer decades ago. They provided copies of old documents that were difficult to read and even harder to understand. But the key point was clear. They believed they had legal authority over my land. David studied the documents for days, consulting with other lawyers and researching property law precedents. His conclusion was troubling. The HOA might actually have a legal case, depending on how the original property transfers were handled. Fighting them would be expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success. But I was not ready to give up. I had put everything into this house, and I was not going to let a power-hungry HOA board destroy my dreams. I told David to fight as hard as necessary. The HOA escalated their tactics immediately. They filed a lien against my property, claiming that the accumulated fines gave them the right to force a sale. They also sent letters to my employer, my bank, and my insurance company, claiming that I was involved in a legal dispute that might affect my creditworthiness. My stress levels skyrocketed. I was barely sleeping, constantly worried about the next threatening letter or legal maneuver. The daily violations continued, each one adding to my financial burden and psychological pressure. I felt like I was under siege in my own home. During this time, I began meeting secretly with other homeowners who had been victimized by the HOA. We would gather in different locations, sharing stories and strategies for dealing with Margaret Stevens and her board. What I learned was shocking. The HOA had been systematically targeting homeowners for years, using violation notices and fines to generate revenue. Several families had been forced to sell their homes to pay accumulated fines. Others had spent thousands of dollars on legal fees, only to give up when they ran out of money. Even more disturbing, we discovered evidence that Margaret Stevens and other board members were personally profiting from the fines and legal fees. They had relationships with preferred contractors who received no-bid contracts for compliance work on violated properties. The whole system was designed to extract money from homeowners while enriching the people in power. I shared this information with David, who began investigating the HOA's financial records and business practices. What he found was a pattern of corruption and abuse that had been going on for years, but proving it in court would require time and resources that I was rapidly running out of. The final straw came when Margaret Stevens issued an ultimatum. Either I would comply with all HOA demands within 72 hours, or they would begin legal proceedings to have my house demolished as a non-compliant structure. The letter arrived on a Friday afternoon, giving me until Monday to surrender completely. I spent that weekend in my Victorian mansion, walking through every room and remembering the love and effort I had put into each detail. The house was perfect. It was beautiful, historically significant, and meticulously maintained. The idea that someone could destroy it over petty rule violations was beyond comprehension. But I was not ready to give up. Not yet. I had one last card to play, though I was not sure it would be enough to save my home. The HOA board meeting on Monday night was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Margaret Stevens had packed the room with supporters, and the atmosphere was charged with tension and anticipation. She clearly expected this to be her moment of ultimate victory, the night she would finally break the homeowner who had dared to challenge her authority. "The board has voted unanimously," Margaret Stevens announced, her voice carrying across the silent room. "The property at 1247 Hillside Drive has been declared a non-compliant structure that poses a threat to community standards and property values. The owner has repeatedly refused to comply with reasonable requests for correction." She paused for dramatic effect, enjoying the attention of the packed room. "Therefore, the board has authorized the demolition of the structure within 72 hours. A professional demolition crew has been contracted, and all necessary permits have been obtained." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Even the homeowners who had been intimidated by Margaret Stevens seemed surprised by the extreme nature of this action. I sat in the back, my heart pounding, but I remained silent. "The owner will be responsible for all demolition costs, site cleanup, and legal fees," Margaret Stevens continued. "If payment is not received within 30 days, the HOA will place a lien on the property and force its sale to recover our expenses." I stood up slowly, every eye in the room turning toward me. "You cannot demolish my house," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I have legal rights, and I will not allow you to destroy my property over made-up violations." Margaret Stevens smiled coldly. "Your legal rights ended when you chose to ignore our authority. The demolition will proceed as scheduled. I suggest you use the next 72 hours to remove any personal belongings you wish to keep." I left the meeting feeling like I had been punched in the stomach. The reality of the situation was sinking in. They were actually going to destroy my house. My beautiful Victorian mansion, the home I had poured my heart and soul into, would be reduced to rubble by the end of the week. David Chen filed emergency motions for restraining orders and injunctions, but the legal system moved slowly. The HOA had their permits and authorizations in place, and stopping them would require proving that their actions were illegal or improper. That would take time, we did not have. The local media picked up the story, but the coverage was mixed. Some reporters portrayed me as a victim of HOA overreach, while others suggested that I had brought this on myself by refusing to follow reasonable community standards. Margaret Stevens was savvy enough to control the narrative, presenting herself as a reluctant enforcer of necessary rules. I spent the next 2 days in a state of controlled panic, moving my most precious belongings out of the house while continuing to fight the demolition through legal channels. Every hour that passed brought me closer to losing everything I had worked for. The demolition crew arrived early on Thursday morning, exactly 72 hours after the ultimatum. 3 large trucks rolled up to my property, carrying a bulldozer, an excavator, and all the equipment needed to reduce my mansion to rubble. The noise was deafening, and neighbors began gathering to watch the spectacle. Margaret Stevens arrived shortly after the crew, accompanied by 2 other HOA board members and a local sheriff's deputy. She stood at the edge of my property with her arms crossed, clearly savoring what she saw as her moment of ultimate triumph. The demolition crew chief approached me with a clipboard, asking me to sign documents acknowledging that the property was being demolished at the request of the HOA. I refused to sign anything, but he explained that the demolition would proceed with or without my cooperation. "You have 15 minutes to remove any remaining personal items," he said. "After that, we begin demolition." I stood in my front yard, watching the bulldozer being unloaded from its trailer. The machine was massive, easily capable of reducing my beautiful Victorian mansion to a pile of broken wood and shattered glass. The operator climbed into the cab and started the engine, the diesel motor rumbling to life. Margaret Stevens walked over to me, unable to hide her satisfaction. "You should have listened when you had the chance," she said. "Now you will lose everything." The bulldozer began moving toward my house, its heavy tracks leaving deep impressions in my carefully maintained lawn. The operator positioned the machine at the corner of the front porch, raising the massive blade that would begin the destruction of my dream home. That was when I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folder of documents I had been keeping secret for months. "Actually," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart, "there is something you need to know first." The bulldozer operator saw my raised hand and immediately stopped his machine. The sudden silence was deafening after the noise of the diesel engine. Margaret Stevens looked at me with confusion and growing irritation. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "The demolition is proceeding as scheduled. You cannot stop this." I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a detailed survey map that I had been researching for months. "This property does not belong to your HOA," I said, my voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "It never has. You have no authority here because this land is under federal jurisdiction." Margaret Stevens laughed, but there was uncertainty in her voice. "That is ridiculous. You are just making up legal nonsense to delay the inevitable." I handed the survey map to the demolition crew chief, who studied it carefully. His expression changed immediately as he recognized the official federal land survey markers and boundary descriptions. "Hold on," he said to his operator. "Shut down the machine. We need to look at this." The document was a federal land survey dating back to 1892, showing that my property was part of a larger federal land grant that had never been properly transferred to private ownership. The Victorian mansion had been built on federal land, and despite decades of property sales and transfers, the underlying federal jurisdiction had never been extinguished. I had discovered this information during my research into the property's history. The confusing paperwork and multiple ownership transfers had been red flags that led me to dig deeper into the land's legal status. What I found was a bureaucratic oversight that had lasted for over a century. "This is impossible," Margaret Stevens said, her voice rising with panic. "The developer assured us that all properties in Sunset Ridge Estates were properly transferred to private ownership." I pulled out the second document, a letter from the Bureau of Land Management confirming that the property remained under federal jurisdiction. "I have been in communication with federal authorities for months," I said. "They have confirmed that this land was never properly transferred out of federal ownership." The demolition crew chief was now studying multiple documents, comparing survey maps and legal descriptions. His team gathered around him, all looking increasingly concerned. Demolishing a structure on federal land without proper authorization was a federal crime that could result in massive fines and criminal charges. "We cannot proceed," the crew chief announced. "If this property is under federal jurisdiction, we need proper federal permits and authorization. Our local permits are not sufficient." Margaret Stevens was now visibly shaking with anger and fear. "This is a stunt," she said. "You are making this up to avoid the consequences of your actions." I pulled out the third document, a copy of my correspondence with a federal attorney who specialized in land disputes. "The federal government has been investigating this situation for weeks," I said. "They are very interested in how a local HOA obtained permits to demolish a structure on federal land without proper authorization." The sheriff's deputy, who had been watching the proceedings with growing concern, stepped forward to examine the documents. After several minutes of careful review, he made a phone call to his supervisor. The conversation was brief but intense. "I need everyone to step back from the property," the deputy announced. "This is now a federal matter, and I am securing the scene until federal authorities can arrive." Margaret Stevens was now in full panic mode. "You cannot do this," she said to me. "You cannot just produce fake documents and stop a legal demolition." I smiled for the first time in months. "These documents are not fake. They are official federal records that prove you never had authority over this property. You have been harassing me, threatening me, and attempting to destroy federal property based on false claims of jurisdiction." The demolition crew was already packing up their equipment, unwilling to risk federal charges for destroying government property. The bulldozer operator climbed down from his machine and began the process of loading it back onto the trailer. Within an hour, 2 federal marshals arrived at the scene. They took custody of all the documents and began interviewing everyone present. Margaret Stevens and the other HOA board members were questioned extensively about their knowledge of the property's federal status and their authority to order its demolition. The federal marshals also interviewed the demolition crew chief, who explained that they had relied on local permits and HOA authorization. He provided copies of all the paperwork the HOA had given him, which would become crucial evidence in the federal investigation. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that Margaret Stevens and her HOA had made a catastrophic error. They had not only harassed a property owner without proper authority, but they had also attempted to destroy federal property while impersonating government officials. The tables had turned completely. My Victorian mansion was safe, protected by federal law and federal authorities. And Margaret Stevens, who had spent months trying to destroy my life, was now facing federal criminal charges that could send her to prison. The federal investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Within a week, FBI agents were interviewing HOA board members, reviewing financial records, and examining the pattern of harassment and abuse that had been ongoing for years. What they found was even worse than I had imagined. Margaret Stevens and her board had been running what federal prosecutors called a criminal enterprise, designed to extract money from homeowners through fraudulent claims of authority. They had targeted dozens of families over the years, using intimidation tactics and bogus legal threats to force compliance with made-up rules. The financial records revealed a web of corruption that involved preferred contractors, kickback schemes, and personal enrichment at the expense of homeowners. Margaret Stevens had been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, including luxury vacations and expensive home renovations for her own property. But the attempted demolition of my house was the crime that brought everything crashing down. Federal prosecutors charged Margaret Stevens and 3 other board members with conspiracy to destroy federal property, impersonation of federal officials, and racketeering under the RICO statute. The demolition company faced massive liability for attempting to destroy federal property without proper authorization. Their insurance company immediately settled with the federal government for millions of dollars, and the company's owner was charged with negligent destruction of government property. The local sheriff's department also came under scrutiny for their role in the incident. The deputy who had been present during the attempted demolition was investigated for failing to verify the HOA's authority before allowing the destruction to proceed. He was eventually suspended without pay and later resigned from the force. Meanwhile, other homeowners in Sunset Ridge Estates began coming forward with their own stories of HOA abuse. The federal investigation expanded to include dozens of additional victims who had been harassed, threatened, and financially damaged by the corrupt board. I filed federal civil rights lawsuits against the HOA and its board members, claiming that they had violated my constitutional rights through their campaign of harassment and intimidation. The case was strengthened by the federal criminal charges and the clear evidence of corruption that had been uncovered. The legal settlement was substantial. The HOA was forced to pay me damages for the harassment, the bogus fines, the legal fees, and the emotional distress I had suffered. But more importantly, the entire HOA system in Sunset Ridge Estates was dissolved and replaced with federal oversight. Margaret Stevens was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for her role in the conspiracy. The other board members received shorter sentences, but all were banned from serving in any HOA leadership positions in the future. The financial penalties were severe enough to bankrupt several of the conspirators. The local media coverage was extensive and favorable. I was portrayed as a hero who had exposed corruption and stood up to institutional bullying. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked HOA power and the importance of knowing your legal rights. But the most satisfying outcome was the transformation of the entire community. Without the oppressive HOA board, Sunset Ridge Estates became a more democratic and neighborly place. Homeowners formed a voluntary association focused on actual community improvement rather than harassment and control. The federal land status of my property was officially recognized and protected. The Bureau of Land Management issued a formal declaration that my Victorian mansion was a historic structure on federal land, giving it additional protections against future interference. I also established a foundation to help other homeowners who were facing similar battles with abusive HOAs. The foundation provides legal assistance, research support, and advocacy for victims of HOA overreach. We have helped dozens of families fight back against corrupt boards and win their cases. The Foundation's work has led to legislative changes in several states, creating new protections for homeowners and stricter oversight of HOA operations. We have also worked with federal authorities to identify and prosecute other corrupt HOA boards across the country. Margaret Stevens appealed her conviction but lost at every level. She served her full sentence and was released after 3 years, but her reputation was destroyed, and she faced continued civil litigation from the homeowners she had victimized. The demolition crew chief who had stopped the bulldozer, when I showed him, the federal documents became a key witness in the prosecution case. He later told reporters that he was grateful to have avoided participating in the destruction of federal property, which could have ended his career and sent him to prison. The sheriff's deputy who had been present during the incident eventually found work in another state, but the scandal followed him throughout his career. He later admitted that he should have questioned the HOA's authority before allowing the demolition to proceed. 2 years after the attempted demolition, my Victorian mansion stands as a symbol of resistance against institutional bullying and the power of individual determination. The house has been featured in architectural magazines and historical preservation publications, celebrated not just for its beauty, but for its role in exposing corruption. The property has become a destination for people fighting similar battles with abusive HOAs and corrupt local authorities. I receive visitors from across the country who want to hear the story and learn about strategies for protecting their own rights. The house has become more than my home. It has become a beacon of hope for others. The foundation I established has grown into a national organization with chapters in 15 states. We have helped hundreds of families fight back against HOA abuse, and our success rate is remarkable. When homeowners understand their rights and have proper legal support, they can defeat even the most powerful and corrupt boards. Our work has led to significant changes in HOA law and oversight. Several states have passed legislation requiring HOA boards to undergo training, submit to regular audits, and provide clear appeals processes for homeowners. The days of unchecked HOA power are slowly coming to an end. I often think about Margaret Stevens and the other board members who tried to destroy my life. Their downfall was swift and complete, but I take no pleasure in their suffering. Their actions hurt many families over the years, and justice was necessary. But revenge was never my goal. Protection and prevention were always more important. The federal land status of my property has been a blessing in unexpected ways. The Bureau of Land Management has provided resources for historical preservation and environmental protection that have enhanced the property's value and significance. The house is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I have also discovered that my property is not unique. There are hundreds of similar situations across the country where federal land grants were never properly transferred to private ownership. Many homeowners are living on federal land without knowing it, and many HOAs are claiming authority they do not actually possess. The Victorian mansion itself has been fully restored to its original grandeur, with additional improvements that honor its historical significance. The wraparound porch where I drink my morning coffee has become my favorite place to reflect on the journey from victim to advocate. Young lawyers often contact me for advice on fighting HOA cases. I always tell them the same thing: do your research, know your rights, and never give up. The system is designed to favor those with power and resources, but the truth has a way of prevailing when people are willing to fight for it. The community of Sunset Ridge Estates has transformed into something beautiful. Without the oppressive HOA board, neighbors have become friends. Children play in the streets without fear of citation. Homeowners take pride in their properties because they choose to, not because they are forced to. I still live in my Victorian mansion, and I plan to stay here for the rest of my life. This house represents everything I believe in: the power of individual determination, the importance of historical preservation, and the possibility of creating something beautiful in a world that often seems determined to tear things down. The demolition equipment that once threatened my home has been replaced by garden tools and paintbrushes. The federal marshals who secured my property have been replaced by friends and neighbors who stop by to admire the roses and share stories on the front porch. Every morning when I wake up in my beautiful Victorian mansion, I am reminded that justice is possible, that corruption can be defeated, and that one person with determination and the right documents can change everything. The house stands as proof that sometimes David really does defeat Goliath.